In the quiet, pre-dawn hours of June 10th, 1912, the small town of Villisca, Iowa, was paralyzed by a silence that no one yet understood. On East 2nd Street, the modest white frame house belonging to Josiah Moore stood perfectly still, its doors locked and its curtains pulled tight against the morning sun. Neighbors noticed the lack of movement. The chickens hadn't been fed. The wood hadn't been chopped, and the boisterous Moore children were nowhere to be seen. It was a stillness that felt heavy, an unnatural departure from the rhythm of a hard-working Midwestern family. When Josiah's brother, Ross Moore, arrived with a spare key to investigate, he stepped into a reality that would shatter the town's innocence forever. The air inside the house was stagnant, carrying a faint metallic scent that Ross Moore could not immediately place. As he pushed open the door to the downstairs guest bedroom, he found a scene that defies the limits of human comprehension. There, in the dim light of a shuttered room, lay the bodies of two young girls, Ina and Lena Stillinger, ages 8 and 12. They had come over for a simple sleepover after a church program, a night of laughter and friendship that had been cut short by an unthinkable violence. Their forms were nearly unrecognizable, their lives extinguished by a heavy, blunt force that had left the room painted in a deep, harrowing red. The girls were visitors, guests in a home they believed to be a sanctuary, yet they became the first discovery in a house of horrors. But the horror did not end in the guest room. As the local marshal, Hank Horton, ascended the narrow stairs to the second floor, the scale of the massacre expanded, and in the primary bedroom lay Josiah Moore and his wife, Sarah. In the adjacent room, their 4 children, Herman, Mary, Arthur, and Paul, were found in their beds. All 8 souls had been bludgeoned while they slept. There were no signs of a struggle for 7 of the 8 victims. They had passed from sleep into eternity without ever knowing a monster stood over them. Only 12-year-old Lena Stillinger showed signs of having been awake, her body positioned in a way that suggested a final, instinctive attempt to defend herself against the encroaching shadow. The weapon was found in the guest room, leaning against the wall as if it were a common household tool. It was Josiah Moore's own axe, taken from the coal shed by someone who knew exactly where to look. The killer had used the blunt back of the head to strike most of the victims. But for Josiah, he had used the sharp blade, swinging with such force that the axe gouged the ceiling above the bed. The brutality was calculated, methodical, and profoundly quiet. In a house where the floors creaked with every step, a killer had navigated the rooms, climbed the stairs, and systematically ended 8 lives without waking a single neighbor. The axe was left behind, but the person who swung it had vanished into the morning mist, leaving a question that would remain unanswered for over a century. As the sun rose higher over Villisca, the news spread like a contagion. This was not a typical crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. The killer had taken nothing of value, yet he had taken everything. The town was forced to confront the reality that a predator had walked among them. He perhaps even watched them from the shadows of the church program just hours before. The investigation began in a state of shock, with officials struggling to make sense of the ritualistic details that emerged from the bedrooms. Why were the mirrors covered? Why was there a plate of food left on the table? These questions began to form a puzzle that grew more complex with every passing hour, as the realization set in that the person responsible was gone, leaving only the cold iron of the axe as a witness to the carnage. The impact on the community was immediate and total. This was a town where no one locked their doors, where everyone knew their neighbor's name, and their neighbor's business. In a single night, that foundation of trust was demolished. The Moore family, well-liked, prosperous, and active in their community, had been targeted in a way that suggested either a deep-seated hatred or a terrifyingly random selection. As the bodies were removed and the house was boarded up, the search for the Axeman began. It was a search that would span years, involve high-ranking politicians, traveling preachers, and suspected serial killers, yet it would ultimately lead to a void. The silence of the 2nd Street house was just the beginning of a mystery that would haunt Iowa for the next 100 years. As the investigation deepened, the physical violence began to take a back seat to the psychological abnormalities found within the Moore household. The marshal and his deputies discovered a series of deliberate ritualistic actions that suggested the killer had not been in a hurry to leave the scene of the massacre. Every mirror in the house, along with every glass surface, had been meticulously covered with articles of clothing taken from the victim's own dressers. It was as if the perpetrator could not bear to see his own reflection, or the eyes of his victims as he moved through the rooms. This was not the behavior of a panicked intruder, but of a person who felt a deep, distorted necessity to alter the environment. The shrouding of the mirrors created a tomb-like atmosphere, a visual representation of a mind that sought to hide its deeds even from the inanimate objects within the home. The kitchen offered its own set of disturbing clues. On the table sat a plate of uneaten food, a slab of bacon and a piece of bread, prepared but never consumed. Nearby, a bowl of bloody water stood as evidence that the killer had taken the time to wash his hands before departing. There was a sense of domesticity turned inside out. A killer who felt comfortable enough in the house of his victims to perform the mundane tasks of a resident. Perhaps the most baffling discovery was a 2-pound slab of bacon, wrapped in cheesecloth, found lying on the floor in the downstairs bedroom near the murder weapon. It served no functional purpose in the crime, yet its placement felt intentional. These details pointed to a specific type of obsession, one that went beyond the act of killing and into a realm of post-mortem ritual that remains unexplained to this day. The most terrifying revelation, however, lay above the bedrooms. In the attic, investigators found evidence that the killer had not broken into the house after the family returned from church. Instead, he had been waiting. 2 cigarette butts were discovered in the crawl space, along with indentations in the insulation that suggested someone had been sitting there for hours. From this vantage point, the killer would have been able to hear the Moore family and the Stillinger girls as they entered the home, said their evening prayers, and drifted into sleep. He sat in the darkness, listening to the sounds of a life he was about to extinguish, holding a weapon he had already selected. The realization that the victims were being watched from within their own walls adds a layer of calculation that is often missing from even the most famous historical crimes. The departure of the killer was as methodical as his arrival. So he had locked every door from the inside and taken the keys with him, ensuring that no one could easily enter the house and discover his work until he was long gone. The town of Villisca sat at a major railway junction, a fact that modern investigators believe was key to the killer's escape. As the sun began to rise and the first neighbors started their morning routines, a phantom was likely boarding a train, moving away from the carnage he had created with the same quiet efficiency he used to carry it out. He left behind a town that would never again feel safe, behind locked doors. The mystery of his identity became the focal point of a massive manhunt, but the trail was already cold by the time the first alarm was raised. The silence of the house on 2nd Street had served its purpose, giving the shadow all the time he needed to vanish. The investigation that followed the discovery on 2nd Street was a collision of small-town panic and a lack of forensic experience. Within hours, the Moore house was swarmed by hundreds of curious onlookers, effectively destroying any chance of collecting fingerprints or tracking footprints. As the local authorities struggled to regain control, the focus shifted to the people who were in Villisca that night. Suspicion first fell upon those who seemed out of place, or those whose presence was marked by an unsettling energy. The search for a motive led investigators down several different paths, ranging from business rivalries to the erratic behavior of a traveling preacher. The town was no longer looking for a stranger. They were looking for a face they might have passed on the street. The most prominent name to emerge from the chaos was Reverend George Kelly. A traveling preacher who had been in town for the Children's Day program, Kelly was known for his eccentricities and a history of mental instability. On the morning after the murders, he had boarded a train before the bodies were even discovered, reportedly telling fellow passengers that 8 people had been killed in their beds while they slept. This knowledge, shared before the news had broken, made him a primary target for the prosecution. Kelly eventually confessed to the crimes in a written statement, claiming a divine voice had commanded him to slay utterly. However, he later recanted his confession, and after 2 sensational trials, he was acquitted. Despite his erratic nature and proximity to the scene, the evidence against him remained circumstantial and deeply debated. While the public focused on the preacher, a private investigator named James Wilkerson turned his attention to a much more terrestrial motive. He became convinced that the murders were a professional hit ordered by a powerful local politician, State Senator Frank Jones. The theory suggested that Jones had a bitter business rivalry with Josiah Moore, and that Moore may have been involved in an affair with Jones's daughter-in-law. Wilkerson believed that Jones hired a man named William Mansfield to carry out the massacre. Mansfield was a suspected serial killer who had been linked to similar axe murders in Illinois and Kansas. The idea of a hired assassin explained the precision and the cold efficiency of the crime. But without a smoking gun or a confession from Mansfield, the grand jury refused to bring charges against the senator or his alleged hitman. The final theory, and perhaps the most haunting one, is that the Villisca killer was not a local man or a hired hand, but a transient serial killer. During the early 1910s, a series of remarkably similar axe murders occurred along the railroad lines of the Midwest. From Colorado to Illinois, families were found murdered in their beds, their faces covered, and their windows shuttered. One name that frequently surfaces in this context is Henry Lee Moore. Just months after the Villisca tragedy, he was convicted of murdering his own mother and grandmother with an axe in a nearly identical fashion. Some modern criminal profilers believe that Henry Lee Moore, or a similar unidentified drifter, used the anonymity of the rails to select his victims, striking with a calculated fury before disappearing into the next state. This theory suggests that the Moore family was not targeted for who they were, but simply because their house was near the tracks and their coal shed held a weapon. In the weeks following the funeral of the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters, the town of Villisca underwent a profound transformation. The open-door policy of rural Iowa vanished overnight. Hardware stores sold out of locks and bolts, and families began sleeping in shifts, terrified that the shadow from 2nd Street was still among them. But as the fear took root, a more corrosive element began to spread. Suspicion. If the killer wasn't a transient, then he was a neighbor. He was someone who sat in the same church pews, someone who bought groceries at the same market. This leads us to a question that the townspeople whispered for decades. Is it possible to live alongside a monster for years and never see the cracks in the mask? The physical evidence left behind only deepened the mystery. Investigators struggled to reconcile the sheer brutality of the axe swings with the delicate, almost tender way the mirrors were covered. Why would a killer, capable of such explosive violence, take the time to ensure the victims' faces were shielded from view? Was it an act of remorse, or was it a ritualistic necessity to prevent the spirits of the dead from watching him? Some modern profilers suggest that the covering of the glass indicates the killer knew his victims personally and couldn't bear the judgment of their reflections. If that is true, then the theory of a random drifter begins to crumble. We have to ask, was this a crime of opportunity, or was it a deeply personal execution disguised as a random act of madness? As the years turned into decades, the Moore house remained a hollow monument to that June night. It passed through various owners, but the stories of its interior never changed. Those who lived there reported the sound of children's footsteps in empty hallways and the feeling of a heavy, oppressive presence in the attic. This raises another unsettling possibility for the modern viewer. Does a house retain the memory of a tragedy? Or is the haunting merely our own minds trying to process an event that has no logical conclusion? Even without the supernatural elements, the house stands as a physical manifestation of a cold case that refuses to go quiet. Why? After more than a century and the advent of modern DNA profiling, has no one been able to definitively name the man with the axe? The failure of the original investigation can be blamed on many things: the contamination of the crime scene, the lack of coordination between agencies, and the political infighting of the era. But perhaps the real reason the case remains unsolved is that we are looking for a single narrative where there may be many. Could the Reverend Kelly have been a convenient scapegoat for a town that needed a villain? Or was the professional efficiency of William Mansfield too terrifying for a small-town jury to acknowledge? As we look back at the evidence, we are forced to wonder, if the killer were standing right in front of us today, would we even recognize him? Or would he look like any other man walking down a quiet Iowa street? The legacy of the Villisca axe murders is not just found in the history books or the ghost stories told to tourists. It is found in the way it changed our understanding of safety. It proved that even in the heart of the most peaceful community, a shadow can wait in the attic for the lights to go out. The Moore family did everything right. They went to church, they looked after their neighbors, and they locked their doors. Yet, they were not alone. As we move into the final chapter of this mystery, we must face the most disturbing question of all. In a world of DNA and digital footprints, could a crime this massive and this ritualistic still happen today? And if it did, would we be any closer to catching the phantom? In the century since the Moore family was laid to rest, the house on 2nd Street has become more than just a crime scene. It has become a monument to the limits of human justice. We are left with a collection of artifacts, a blood-stained axe, a slab of bacon, and a series of covered mirrors that tell a story with no final chapter. The town of Villisca eventually moved on, but the house remained, a silent witness to a night of violence that should have been impossible in such a close-knit community. This leads us to consider the nature of cold cases. Is it possible that the truth is right in front of us, hidden in a detail we've overlooked for over 100 years? When we look at the suspects, we see 3 entirely different versions of evil. We have the Reverend George Kelly, the erratic outsider whose own mind may have betrayed him. We have William Mansfield, and the professional who may have been a shadow for hire. And we have Henry Lee Moore, the transient who turned the American railway system into a hunting ground. Each theory has its merits, and each has its flaws. But if we can't agree on a name, we have to ask a more difficult question. Does it matter who held the axe if the result was the same? Or does the lack of a conviction mean that the killer, in some dark way, achieved the ultimate victory over the law? Today, the house is a destination for those seeking to touch the veil of the past. People travel from all over the world to spend a night in the rooms where the massacre occurred, hoping to find an answer that the 1912 grand juries could not. But as they sit in the dark, listening to the house settle, they often find something far more unsettling than a ghost. But they find the realization that the Moore family was just like any other. They were a family who felt safe in their own beds, never imagining that the very walls protecting them were also hiding a predator. This brings us to a haunting thought. How many of us truly know what is happening in the quiet corners of our own homes while we sleep? The Villisca axe murders remain Iowa's most enduring mystery because they defy the rules of a typical crime. There was no robbery, no clear motive, and no survivor to tell the tale. We are left only with the signatures of a mind that operated on a frequency we cannot understand. As we close the diary on this case, we have to wonder if the truth died with the killer, or if it's still buried somewhere in the archives of a small Iowa town. If you were standing in that house tonight, looking into a covered mirror, what would you expect to see? Would you see a monster? Or would you see the face of someone you thought you knew? The story of the Moore family is a reminder that the past is never truly gone. It just waits for someone to look closely enough at the shadows. The axe is still there, the house is still standing, and the questions are louder than ever. We may never know for certain who climbed those stairs on that warm June night, but the silence they left behind is a warning that echoes through every locked door in America. As the screen fades to black, the mystery of Villisca remains as sharp and as cold as the iron that carved it into history. Now, I want to hear from you. After seeing the evidence and the strange rituals left behind, who do you believe was in the attic that night? Was it the unstable preacher, the hired assassin, or a drifter passing through on the rails? Drop your theories in the comments below. I'll be reading them. And if you want more deep dives into the cases that history tried to forget, make sure to subscribe to The Killer's Diary.